Good evening. Before I introduce Stuart Burrows, who's going to be giving the lecture tonight, there's some health and safety stuff we have to go through. There are two exits, the door you came through probably from the main door here, and also there's a door at the back as well, which you can escape from. And you're meant to congregate, if you go out of the building, you're meant to congregate at the side of the building here, so that we can count you, I suppose. Having done the necessary formalities on health and safety, I'm going to introduce Stuart Burrows, who is the director of the Bath at Work Museum. I don't know whether everybody here has been to that museum. It's in St. Julian's Road, is that right? Next to Christ Church. And I went there, I didn't know about it until I was asked to convene this meeting, but I went there last week. And it's a truly excellent museum, and I really recommend going there if you haven't been there. It's very instructive, very interesting on the history of Bath, and very, very well organized and presented. So having given that flattery for the museum, to introduce Stuart, just to say he's a Bathonian. He studied history, worked in museums in Wales and in Bristol before coming back to Bath to take up the directorship at the museum here. He's going to be giving the first of 3 talks on the war in Bath. The first one tonight is Making War, the Manufacturing for the War Economy. Next Monday, it's the Bath Blitz. And the Monday after that, there's a talk on the Admiralty in Bath. These are not going to be given by Stuart, they're going to be given by other people, but I think he will tell us more about that. So having made the introduction, the talk will last for about 45-50 minutes. Then there'll be questions. There'll be some possibly coming from online as well. And then we have to be out of here by 9 o'clock. So with that introduction, I welcome Stuart.
Well, first of all, thank you for asking me to come. I'm glad you're all able to make it this evening. I don't know about you, and I'd hesitate to ask what you did during the COVID lockdown, the pandemic. Well, one of the things I did was put on my vinyl records in alphabetical order. The other thing was I watched the box set of the ITV documentary, The World at War. And I watched one episode every day. There are 26 50-minute episodes, which was a sobering and emotional experience, I should say. I don't know if you have seen it recently or saw it when it was on. If you're ever stuck for a present for someone, I thoroughly recommend it. It really is, it's one of the best documentaries ever made, I think, in this country. And one of the things about the stories, was one of the points of the series was that these big stories, you know, D-Day invasion, very large operations were in fact a lot of very small operations put together, which sounds trite to say, but it's really what this talk is about. It's about how places like Bath, and Bath is not unusual in this regard, you know, market towns across the country are engaged in manufacture, invention, production for the war effort. And whether that is for the home front or whether that is for fighting abroad, you know, and companies of various sizes, complexions and type are involved in making things. This picture you may have seen is from the Chronicle, the use of the Roman baths as a laundry. You know, the fact that, you know, the special facilities of Bath hot water springs put to use. So the particular things that Bath was good at, you know, made advantage of when it came to what its location, for one thing, what would be good to produce for the war effort. This is one of the most famous paintings of the Second World War. Ruby Loftus Threading a Breech Ring by Dame Laura Knight. And, you know, one of the things needless to say, I think, is that how a lot of the production, by which I would include food and drink, as well as, you know, what you might call factory manufactures in the Second World War, is being carried out by women. There are reserved occupations for men, of course, but women are being called into the factories in every regard. Bath is no exception in this, and the pictures I'm going to show you will often feature women involved in production of things required by us in the city to sustain the city and its surroundings, and also those things that will go to supply the armed forces. This picture is taken at Stotherton Pit, one of the factories that I'll talk about a little bit later, one of the major manufacturing companies. This, you can see, if you can see the time on the clock, it's 1 o'clock. And the reason why they're looking so happy is they're clocking off for lunch, you know, after having been involved in heavy duty work. Women had been involved in manufacturing of armaments and all sorts of other things in the First World War. And the historian Stephen Ambrose, you know, talks about the long war, the 30 Years' War, which starts in 1914, ends in 1945 with a long armistice in the middle. Is sometimes described as the European Civil War, the war of the first part of the 20th century. So women working in factories is not an unusual thing. It had been going on since at least 1914. But it's really during the Second World War, it starts to be, you know, chronicled in moving film and photographs like this. First thing you might say, sometimes overlooked during the war, is the need to feed people. You know, we're talking about manufacturing, but, you know, the feed of animals and people, when agriculture needs to be intensified because of the absence of imports, the restricted imports. This painting by Evelyn Dunbar, a land girl, Women's Land Army, engaged in maximizing production, turning over pasture to arable land, maximizing the production of meat as much as there could be. This is another one by Evelyn Dunbar. This is members of the Women's Lands Army learning how to milk a cow, which you might have seen these pictures. So absolutely essential to keep you know, people in this country fed. So, you know, agriculture in the surroundings of Bath. And I think it's worth saying that, you know, for most of the last 2,000 years, Bath has been at heart a provincial market town in an agricultural district. It might not look like it, but a lot of what goes on here until relatively recently is to do with agriculture. It's to do with animal and arable. The other need, you know, is heat, light for the people who are going to live in Bath, you know, the civilians and the people who are going to be working in the home factories. Bath Gaslight and Coke Company, one of the world's first, actually. Bath has a pioneer gasworks, you know, providing all the light, mainly light, gas cookers and that kind of thing. A bomb landed in the largest gas holder at the top of this picture when the city is bombed in April 1942. Didn't explode, but what it did is it pierced the top of the gas holder, a shell. The gas holder collapsed because it was full of gas, and they found the unexploded bomb at the bottom of it. I mean, if it had gone off, it would have, you know, left a crater, a pretty big crater. You might be able to see, just as a matter of, oops, where are we? Up here, I don't know if you can, whether you can see with the eye of faith, it actually says Bath painted on the top of the largest gas holder. That's because in the 1930s, the Air Ministry required private gas companies to paint the name of the town where they were located on the top of the gas holders in case pilots got lost. So if they could find their way to the nearest gas works, they could find where they were. And the reason why it's painted over, of course, is it's wartime. They don't want the Germans to know where they are. So that's why you can hardly see it. But in the period after 1941, there are lots of women working in the gasworks. You don't think of these trades, but hard manual labour going on, stoking the retort houses of the gasworks. Food's not only the supply of agricultural products is controlled by the Ministry of Food, but some of the makers of food and drink are under direct government control. These are bottles from the museum where I work that were owned by a small soft drinks making company, JB Bowler and Sons Limited. In the Second World War, there are 3 or 4 drinks manufacturers in Bath making lemonade and that kind of thing. And in order to keep the morale of the home front up, the government are prepared to support the making of fizzy drinks, lemonades and that kind of thing. But they force the various companies to only make a very restricted range, so they can make the most of the scarce resources of the sugar equivalent, saccharin and things like that. And in fact, JB Bowler and Sons were only allowed to make lemonade and cherryade. So the other companies made the other ranges of drinks. So you've got all the drinks. It's just that they were restricted and controlled by something called the SDI, the soft drinks industry. And that's the factory of JB Bowler on the corner of Corn Street. And the Ambury, they're an interesting company in another regard, in fact. They're a small company supplying small goods to other companies. They are subcontracted by bigger companies to do the kind of jobs that the bigger companies don't want to do. And you get this sort of chain of subcontracting in things like the motor industry. They're part of the chain of subcontracting from engineering firms all around the area. So the bigger companies, which tend to get the most fame, if that's the word, certainly that you will have heard of, firms like Stoddart and Pitt, for example. They're supported by companies like JB Bowler. They're also engaged and very important in supporting the repair industries that will go on in this city after the bombing in April of 1942. Because, making good the houses and the commercial premises are as important as supplying armaments. These companies, they may be small and undistinguished, but they're absolutely essential in this kind of network of supply and undertaking even the smallest of jobs. Rather, like I said at the beginning, the big jobs are lots of small jobs put together. Firms like this are critical in that job. Not all of them survive. This is a picture of a factory in Monksdale Road in Oldfield Park. The firm of Stanley Engineering received a direct hit. And there you can see the remains of the factory, an explosive bomb, not an incendiary bomb. And the factory it subsequently becomes part of the Clark's Shoe business, red brick building in Oldfield Park, but unluckily hit by a bomb. Then there are the companies which make products which maybe you wouldn't associate with the war effort. This is a little extract from a review of the products of Harbert's plasticine. Harbert's plasticine had been used in the First World War as ear protection for artillery men. It had been used, they stuffed it in their ears. They didn't say how you get it out, but I mean, they mixed the plasticine with wool. So it made a kind of a fibrous block. but it was also used for making three-dimensional models of the Western Front, because you made it in different colors, so you can make maps and that have you. And there you can see some of the things. It says here 1914-18 and the last war. This is a review of their products just after the Second World War. And you can see they're talking about used in connection with gas marks, machine guns, hand grenades, and as a kind of sealant. It's used in the same way as we might use blue tack a lot of the time, but it's certainly used in making models. It's used by the Admiralty in making models for the products that they will design, and firms like Stolt and Pitt are using it because you can make anything in 36 different colors by 1939. So plasticine is you may feel that this little factory out in Barthampton was simply making an entertainment for children, but here you have it being put to very clear war use. One of the things they suggest is that, rather recklessly, I'd say, that in the case of a gas attack, which there was a great deal of concern would be a major way that the Germans would attack with gas bombs, that you could seal your house with plasticine. So the windows, all those leaky sash windows in Georgian townhouses, and you can see keyholes, ventilators were absolutely secure from gas. Which, it seems a sort of dangerous claim to make. However good plasticine is, can you avoid to ignore this safeguard, as it says there? Luckily, I think probably for everyone concerned, they don't use gas in attacking places like Bath, and so you didn't need to seal your keyholes with plasticine. This is the staff of Harbert's plasticine in Barthampton just after the Second World War. And again, you can see almost entirely women involved in the mass production of this material. It's used all over. And Barthampton, you may well note, the only place on earth where it was made, only in Barthampton High Street, wherever it appears on the planet, that was the only place you could get it. This is the Victoria Brick and Tile Works. This is just a Victorian industry making bricks in Oldfield Park. This, I don't know if you can see here, this line here is the line of what had been the Somerset and Dorset Railway, the Midland Railway going south through Oldfield Park. And here you can see the clay pits of the brickworks. It closed in 1939, but almost immediately reopened because there's a need for bricks, for repairs, particularly after 1942, after the bombing of the city. All this need for the basics of the construction industry, the repair industry, wood and bricks from here to do the repairs for all those businesses and houses which have been bombed flat. This is the kiln here, and this great chimney. After the war, almost as soon as the war finished, it was closed, and this chimney was dynamited shortly afterwards. Another mineral product with wartime application. This is the Fuller's Earthworks. It's now it's on the Dunkerton Road on the top of Odd Down. In fact, just up here, this is the A367 running along here. These houses are still there, actually. And Fuller's Earth is a clay. Bath's one of the only places in the south of England where you can get it. It's a very absorbent material. It's used in clarifying vegetable oil. They use it in making things like margarine or whatever it's called these days. I don't think you call it margarine, do you? You have to call it something else. But it's used in clarifying vegetables and mineral oils. So it's used in the refining industry. But its major application, its domestic application was the fact it's got very high absorption. It's a clay which will absorb any kind of liquid, oil, and you could use it if machinery. I mean, it's one of its applications, and used a great deal in military vehicles, was if you over-oiled machinery, if there was too much oil, you could use Fuller's Earth to help absorb it. So you could regulate how oily the machinery was, or whatever you were running, by having Fuller's Earth to hand. I imagine you may have used Fuller's Earth in the past at home, had almost limitless applications, a bit like plasticine. But during the Second World War, they expand the size of this works. They double the extraction of the clay, which is actually dug out of workings under here in adits that go into the hillside. So an important industry for the war. The most famous companies concerned with supplying, directly supplying the war effort abroad, you might say, the military forces, are the large engineering companies. Bath is, I think it's rather less well known for these companies. I think its history tends to have been, skewed in another direction. But in the 19th and the first part of the 20th century, Bath is as famous for its engineering products as for anything else. This is a picture taken at the Stothard and Pitt Works, and there are several of those. By 1939, Bath has the largest manufacturing employer in the area. During the Second World War, one of the factories, Stothard and Pitt, the Victoria Works, runs almost 24 hours a day. There are 2 shifts, a day and night shift, turning out a range of products, shell cases, as you can see here, being turned out on this lathe. But the thing that makes a difference, you might say, and there's a talk later, isn't there, which is to do with the arrival of the Admiralty, is that even before 1939, when the Admiralty arrived, and here you can see Admiralty workers outside the Empire Hotel on Grand Parade, which they would occupy as offices. Stothard and Pitt had been contractors to the armed forces, in particular the Royal Navy, making all sorts of machinery, lifting gear, winches, which they supply by the thousand. Deck machinery, capstans, davits for lifeboats, all of that kind of machinery. So there already was a relationship between, the Navy, the Admiralty, and firms like Stothard and Pitt as naval contractors. In the war, that relationship, they're now geographically in the same city. Stothard are engaged in research for works that the Admiralty will put into actuality. Part of the Mulberry Harbour arrangements for the after D-Day, artificial bridges, or rather temporary bridges, that they will lay to facilitate the forces after the arrival in D-Day in June 1944. And a whole series of sort of secret projects. One of the things was the development of these midget submarines from 1941. Stothard were engaged in this top secret project to make what were sometimes were known as chariots, but were in fact very large torpedoes, really. These 2 men bravely riding a motorized cylinder with a detachable warhead. So this is high explosives here. And the idea was these were launched from warships to go under enemy warships, to release the warhead, and then to get out of the way as quickly as possible So these things would blow up underneath Italian warships in the Mediterranean. That's when they were most successful. I mean, they weren't just experiments, they were used. And this big, as you can see, midget submarines, human torpedoes, which sounds like something you might find at the circus. But I mean, these, it must have been absolutely terrifying to ride one of these things. They actually, Stoddart and Pitt, when they made the first experimental one, they tested it in the River Avon down by the what will become the Churchill Bridge. So you may well have seen, if you've been wandering across, the Lower Bristol Road, two men like this trying not to get themselves blown up, but very successful. And there's a museum in Portsmouth of the submarines, and there is one of these chariots, a Stoddart and Pitt produced chariot, on display. Here you see more workers at Stoddart's. These are doing, again, doing shell turning. Lots of that going on. They make these temporary bridges for use where bridges have been blown up by the enemy in France. I mean, one of the things, talking about the pandemic, which I did right at the very beginning, is how you remember that production of every kind was suddenly stepped up, making the PPE and all those other things. Firms like Stoddart and Pitt, when it becomes clear that there's going to be invasion of France, production, the government are contracting business to companies all over the country. Stoddart's are just one of those, supplying these kind of things which are going to be needed when bridges have been blown up. And one of the things that they're involved in is supplying equipment for the landing craft, which will spearhead the Normandy invasions. They don't build the landing craft, but they engineer the equipment that will allow heavy vehicles to be landed on the beaches. So this is something that Stoddart was involved in, the design of and the production of, in connection with these larger landing craft for equipment in Normandy. There you can see something on test. This tank here, I think this is a Matilda tank here. And this equipment, this sort of extendable, flexible track, which will allow the tanks to be loaded, rather offloaded on the beaches of Normandy. So, it's not small scale stuff, this. They're making large numbers of these flexible tracks. This is why they're working 24 hours a day. They're also supplying cranes to the ports of Normandy. They're critical after the invasion, because the ports of places like, Dunkirk and Boulogne and places like that, they've been almost completely destroyed. So Stoddart supply cranes which are prefabricated, that can be assembled very quickly by inexperienced sappers, troops. They've been designed to be put together like kits, so they could be assembled at the ports of northern France in order to get them going again. So, and this is one of those. It might not look like a kit, and it's a very big one, but it is one of these prefabricated cranes that they could use, which are actually essential in supplying the armed forces as they edge away from Normandy. This is a picture of Victoria Bridge Road, almost unrecognizable now. The only thing that really is recognizable is the Victoria Bridge. That's the suspension footbridge that links the Western Riverside on the south and the Upper Bristol Road on the north. But here you can see a row of houses. This is Albert Terrace. This is the edge of the Stotherton pit works. This picture was taken in 1945, and this is lunchtime. So, this is the lunch rush, leaving the factory while they, as I say, almost this 24-hour production. Another company associated with engineering of different sort are those that came from the Horseman family. Horsemans were German immigrant clock and watch makers, come to Bath in the middle of the 19th century. The thing that they were most famous for, and in fact, quite possibly the city's most famous invention, possibly, is this, the streetlight control. They adapted alarm clocks to do something other than ring a bell. And that was to control the supply of gas to a lamp, which sounds like a simple idea, but no one had thought of it before. So essentially, by programming this in the same way as you program an alarm clock mechanically, it would turn on the supply to a pilot light, the light comes on, it goes off at a set time. So it's like an alarm clock that goes off and on. And these things, these time switches, are the first of their kind, really. The first mechanism which you can pre-program to do something automatically. People don't need to be engaged. You don't need to do lamp lighters. During the Second World War, the first part of the Horseman family, because there are two, had set up something called the Horseman Gear Company. And the Horseman Gear Company make these time controls. One of the things that they adapt them for straight away is for the detonation of magnetic mines. What the Admiralty had discovered was that if you had a magnetic mine which was activated by a steel ship going close to it, iron ship, steel ship, would activate a magnetic mine. But what they discovered, that the magnetic mines were so sensitive, they would explode before they could do too much damage. So they'd explode when the ships, the target which was activating the mine was still quite a distance away. So what Horsemen do is they devise a delay timer, which will be fitted in the mine. So when it's activated, the clock would start, it would count down to allow the ship to get closer, and then it would blow up. And the delay would allow the mine to be more effective. So that was the first thing they do. They also are involved in the development of two things used by Spitfire pilots. This, which is a bank indicator. It shows the pilot how steep a turn he's made. You would have thought they might have had something like this before, but this, as you can see, it shows the turn to the left and to the right. It was intended for use if you were engaged in a dogfight with a Messerschmitt or something, and you didn't have time. You could just glance at it, and it would show you how steeply you were turning. So that was one thing they made. They also made this curious thing. I had to look this up because I'd forgotten how it worked. And this was something, had a timer. That's what they were good at. This is a clock, and you can see you wound it up. And every 15 seconds, no, for 15 seconds in every minute, and in fact, you can see here, this is the 15 seconds. During that time, this would send out a radio signal. For the other period, it wouldn't. So automatically, every minute for 15 seconds, this would send out a signal. So the pilot's position could be detected by ground stations. And it was called a remote contactor because the pilot didn't have to do anything. It did itself. So this is another application of that alarm clock technology, you might say. It's been programmed to do something at a set time. And so providing you wind it up, it will do it. So there are interesting lot, the gear company. There is another part of the Horseman family, though, who had set up a car company in 1913, Sydney Horseman. Interesting inventor, businessman. Sometimes let the invention get in the way of the business. But one of the things that towards the end of the car company's life, I mean, it had a fairly checkered career, the Horseman Car Company, but he'd invented, in collaboration with someone called George Carwadine, whose name might be familiar to you for two reasons. First of all, Carwadine, the coffee grinders that used to be in Old Bond Street. But George Carwadine is the person who invented the Anglepoise lamp and the use of opposed springs. And he'd worked with Sydney Horseman on this. This is a Horseman car, and it has each one of the four wheels is independently suspended. So the axle isn't on springs. Each wheel is independently sprung. So when you go over a bump, only one of the wheels goes up. You know, if the bump is this side, this wheel's not affected. So the car kind of floats over obstacles. And it was called slow motion suspension. And he invented it in 1927. The problem with it, and in fact, I think this is a photograph, it's a painting taken from a photograph of someone trying to adjust it while on holiday in France. So these children here wondering what's going on. And the reason why he's adjusting it is because this sort of sprung system made the car, people used to complain of something like seasickness, because you didn't bump over something, you kind of floated. And the car was in constant motion. And the reason being that these cars were very light. There was hardly any weight, to hold the springs down. Come the Second World War, when things rather heavier than the early cars need suspension like this, and this is the system. This is slow motion suspension fitted to and arm a small tank. Armored personnel carriers and things like that were fitted with this suspension system experimentally at the beginning of the war, because this was ideal. The weight of these vehicles would keep the springs held down, but you'd still have that suspension system and able to go over bumps without the kind of problems that you get with cars. This is from the Bath Chronicle, and you can see it says, "Hush, hush at Bath, slow motion springs to absorb shocks." So what had been Horseman cars and had developed something which was unsuccessful for motor cars has a sort of second life. He's extended a way in which the company can succeed in making a different type of product. And so the car company becomes a defense contracting company. In 1941, Horseman Cars becomes Horseman Limited Defense Contractors. As you can see there, a baby tank was careering gaily about and into holes and inclines at a speed of up to 30 miles an hour. And this form of suspension was used on most British battle tanks until the 1990s. And in fact, there are tanks that still use it now. And Horseman Limited became Horseman Defence in Locksbrook Road, which is still there. The defence contractors still there. This is on Lansdowne Road. I hadn't discovered this picture before. This is from the Chronicle, just around the corner from the museum, actually. And there you can see a car, Horseman car there. And here's a little tank, the baby tank passing through the city after trials yesterday. So, these were essential for the new, developing technology of armoured vehicles. There's Jack Warner, you know, the Dixon Dot Green, visiting the factory, the Horseman Limited factory. This is Sydney Horseman here, and he's on a kind of workers' playtime type of event, you know, visiting the factory, raising morale, telling jokes, I expect. The other major supplier of war equipment, you might say, is Bath Cabinet Makers, which seems like a strange thing to say. This is Bath Cabinet Makers factory as it stood on the Lower Bristol Road, taken from the river. This, in fact, from Weston, the site of what's now the Bath Spa University's Locksbrook campus, looking across to this red brick building, which had been built in the First World War, at the bottom of Lansdowne View, if you're trying to get your bearings. Bath Cabinet Makers during the First World War had made aircraft components, wings for the Bristol fighter. So aircraft wings and propellers made in the factory, supplied to Bristol, some of them. Others were assembled in Bath, in places like the Pavilion in North Parade, and the assembly rooms, appropriately. Aircraft were assembled in the assembly rooms, wings and what have you made at the factory. In the Second World War, this picture, it was a reserved occupation, this, because cabinet making, you know, was a skilled trade. You know, these people aren't, with all due respect to carpenters, they're not carpenters. You know, these are people who are used to making precision wooden products, using, you know, advanced skills and advanced equipment. So it's principally men who are involved in this. Women are involved, but it's men, as you can see. And the thing that they're most famous for were making these wooden gliders for, you know, landing paratroopers. So coming back to D-Day in 1944, you know how essential, before the landing even, that gliders like this carrying paratroopers who were dropped out, and then the Horsa gliders then landing when required. These were made under, you know, very secret conditions at the cabinet makers' works on the Lower Bristol Road. They also had another factory in Bellots Road, where you might know the Booker Cash and Carry premises are in Oldfield Park. That's where there was another cabinet making factory where they were turning out these, or at least parts for these, and they were being assembled elsewhere. So, you know, very important. This is Bathford Paper Mill, still operating, you may know, near the bottom of Bathford Hill, making paper for printing of manuals that would be used by the armed forces. So paper of all sorts, particularly, you know, salvaged paper. One of the things that I find quite annoying in my job is the lack of records, document records, for some of the larger companies in Bath from before the Second World War. And one of the reasons why there is a shortage is because during the Second World War, a lot of these companies were encouraged to take their historic documents for paper salvage, to be recycled. So they weren't chucked out and they weren't burnt or bombed. They went to places like the Bathford Mill, where they could be recycled for the paper that was needed for the war. This picture was taken just before the Second World War, actually. But, you know, the mill carries you know, on right through, and as I say, still in existence. This is the Pitman Press. This is the other end, you might say. This is where army manuals are being printed, mass-produced, you know, all that technical paperwork, which would be distributed to all of the soldiers, you know, how to clean a rifle and that kind of thing. These manuals being produced at the Lower Bristol Road site, and they're all drinking milk As you can see, this must be sort of mid-morning. I think this is the managing director here. So they've had this picture taken for publicity purposes. In fact, you can see there, 10:05. They're having a bit of a break from all that printing and carrying on. And, you know, practically the whole workforce there, I think, you know, making the manuals that are needed for instruction. Finally, a few sort of related to manufacturing, you know, the transport infrastructure, you know, the way that you will get the products which are being turned out in places like Bath to where they need to go. And one of those bits of infrastructure is the canal network. You know, by the 1930s, you'd think that this kind of obsolete way of getting things around the water, the inland waterways, brought back to life, miraculously brought back to life. You know, the Kennet Avon Canal, the River Avon, you know, what this sort of 18th century way of transporting goods brought back to life for distributing goods. And this picture was taken on the Kennet Avon Canal. And you can see there a lineup of canal working women. And the railways, of course, you know, put into production. Bath, rather luckily, on this kind of crossroads, you know, the Great Western Railway from east to west, the Midland Railway, which comes down from the north, which connects up with the Somerset and Dorset Railway, which comes up from the south. So Bath's at a kind of cross. You can go east-west or north-south, from the south coast of Bournemouth to all points north, from London at the end of the Great Western Railway to all points west. So, you know, the railways distributing all those goods, it's no surprise to find, you know, these large businesses like Stoddart's on the riverside a corridor, you might say, a flatland. Flatlands are a premier in Bath, you'll know, I'm sure. The floodplain at Bath is quite narrow. And if you're having a large factory-based industry, and what you need is a lot of flat land. So that's why these businesses like the Gasworks and Stothart and Pitt, you know, are on the riverside corridor, which luckily is where the roads and the railways run. This is at Weston on the near what used to be called the Dolphin Inn, Lower Weston, looking across to this textile mill, a spinning shed actually. Twerton had since the Middle Ages been a centre for the production of woolen cloth. And by the 1930s, there's not only a woolen cloth making factory, there's a clothing factory of the firm of W&R Cook. During the Second World War, the woolen factory is bombed in 1942 and with high explosive bombs, you know, almost completely destroyed. They were making fabric for army uniforms, which were being run up at the clothing factory next door, the W&R Cook's clothing factories. They were making military uniforms. W&R Cook carry on, wool fabric coming from West Wiltshire. And the woolen industry, it never recovers from the destruction of their production in 1942. The last wool mill closed in 1954. Finally, I mean, it's worth saying, you know, that all this production is going under the, you know, the most trying of circumstance. You know, it's one thing to talk about invention and production and people working in these kind of conditions, but I mean, it is the most trying circumstance. And it does make you wonder how people kept going, really. Whether they were working in factories at home, you know, and particularly after this very short period, but very destructive weekend at the end of April 1942, when the city is, you know, comprehensively bombed. But these businesses that had been established for decades in some cases. In the case of Stoddart and Pitt, they've been going for, 150 years by the time the war breaks out, would continue after the war with the rebuilding of Bath, let alone anywhere else, but absolutely essential to the war effort. So I think I've kept to time, haven't I? I was asked to speak for 45 minutes, so I was very conscious of not overrunning it. So thank you.
We'll now pass the microphone round for questions, but perhaps first I could just ask a very quick question. What was I'm amazed at Bath's industrial history, because I've never associated Bath with manufacturing. But what was the population of the city at that time?
At the outbreak of the Second World War,
Yeah,
it's about 70,000. It's a sizable city.
Did it increase during the war?
I don't think so. I think it stayed about the same. I think after the war it starts to grow again.
Yeah.
But I think it was pretty substantial, even at the beginning of the war.
Yeah. And why has Bath declined since the war? It seems to have been a hive of industry during the war. Why the decline or the disappearance largely of manufacturing?
Well, I think this is more of a national story than a local one.
Quite likely, yeah.
I think, the disappearance of factory industry through outsourcing is one of the things. I think there is quite a lot of manufacturing in Bath, even now. It's just the smokestack industries of yore, when large numbers of people working in factories, they've disappeared. What you have are businesses that are engaged in craft manufacture, the level of craft. There's a great deal of that. Small scale manufacturing, turning things out. There are still our engineering companies. Companies like Cross Manufacturing, which you may be familiar with, Precision Engineers at Midland Road. But I think there's nothing exceptional about what happens with the deindustrialization of Bath. The other thing that's worth saying is that I know you showed that rather comic picture of laundry being dried at the Roman baths, but during the Second World War, Bath really is just like anywhere else. It's a town with manufacturing capacity. So I don't think there's anything exceptional about it. It's just a place where people are working for the common good.
Good, thank you. Questions?
Are there indications that there was a fair amount of disposable income flooding around the city with all these people working all these long shifts? And were they out enjoying themselves with it? Or were they too tired to actually go down the pub after a shift?
Well, I'm sorry. There's a lack of things to spend your money on. And in fact, because the supply of goods are restricted and rationed in order to prevent inflation, there's only so much you can spend money on. And, that's when they restrict opening hours in pubs and that kind of thing. I think it's more, I think the supply is restricted rather than the demand. I think there probably was people who did have money in their pockets, but there wasn't anything to spend it on, or very restricted things to spend it.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to add a comment to help, perhaps to aid you regarding the population of Bath. I'm the speaker at the talk on the Admiralty when it came to Bath. So I've looked closely at these numbers. Very briefly, in 1939, the population of Bath was roughly what you said, it was 68,000. And it increased dramatically from three sources. One of those sources, of course, was Admiralty staff moving down here and later bringing their families with them. There was also a temporary influx, which for much of the war, from evacuated children known as vacquees in
Yeah.
Bath,
Mm.
and that added probably 10 to 12,000. And then there was an ingress of temporary people, mainly from the Irish Republic, who were employed on building all the underground tunnels, works and factories around Corsham and not too far from Bradford on Avon. That probably pulled in about 15,000.
Right.
Nick McCamley is the expert on this. He's
Right.
written very extensively about it. But I would say the population of Bath therefore increased
Right.
by mid-45 to 100,000 people.
Wow. Yeah, well, there you are.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for a really interesting talk. Do we know if for the manufacturing companies in Bath that were working directly for the Ministry of Defence as contractors, would the war have been good for profits, or were in the national interest, were profits sort of kept at a low level? In other words, did they do well out of the war or less well?
I think they did quite well out of the war. I think there were the contracts that were, I mean, it's rather like these PPE contracts. I think they were, the companies like Stuart were contracted to supply things on time. And if they did supply them, they had this arrangement called Profit Plus, by which, you would be rewarded if things were delivered ahead of time. So I think they were very efficiently run. I think they benefited, quite a great deal from the war. And then after the war, they cemented these contracts with government. It was good for them in that way as well, because after the war, they'd still be in contact by doing government work.
There was mention during the film of hush hush tanks
Mm.
and all that sort of thing. Did the Germans not get to know about them because the bombing wasn't particularly focused on the engineering works, for example, was it?
Well, this is the rather contentious subject, isn't it? This to what extent Bath was a military target? To what extent the bombing in 1942 was in a way or included targeting of industrial production as well as the Baedeker targets. This is something that I think historians have pondered over for a long time. But I think the work that's being done in these factories, they must have been aware of it. I mean, that's in the newspaper, that's in the Evening Chronicle. The Admiralty had been in Bath since September 1939. So they were very well aware that things were going on. If they're reading the newspapers, I mean, I don't think you didn't need to be, James Bond to work out this was going on. I suspect they were quite well aware of what was going on.
Are there any more questions? But perhaps oh, sorry, go ahead.
I know we're going to have a talk about the Admiralty later, but I think on a previous occasion, you said the arrival of the Admiralty kicked Bath into the 20th century from a place of sedate retirement, or words to that effect.
Did I say that?
I
don't remember.
There's a YouTube of you saying something like that.
Did I say something like that? Well, I think our colleague at the rear of the room who's going to talk on the Admiralty, but might be a better place to qualify.
Yeah. What was the long-term effect of the war on industry in Bath, and did it move? Nowadays, there's a lot of consultancy and design going on in Bath, and rather less manufacturing. What was the long-term effect of industry from the war?
Well, I mean, as I think I said to this gentleman, I think a lot of those companies which had been fairly low, fairly small, like Horseman Limited, for example. I mean, they're a fairly modest business. I mean, the Horseman car making business was failing almost from the start. And the development of this suspension system is a godsend, because suddenly practically every heavy vehicle needs it, uses it. So these companies go from doing that. I think Stothert and Pitt cement their reputation for doing that kind of work. And then all those little subcontracting firms like JB Baylor and Stanley Engineering, they all benefit as well. So I think when the manufacturing capacity of this country is being supported, Bath is just like anywhere else. I mean, I think as I said a bit earlier, the disappearance of large-scale manufacturing in this city is just a national phenomenon. Firms like Horseman Gear, they do a great deal more defence contracting work. So while the armed forces are in need of these kind of skills and goods, then the Bath firms are making them.
If it is true that if it is true that the 50s were largely taken with recovery and rebuilding, would it be true to say that a decision was then taken by the city fathers to go down the route of higher education and having a university? Or did the university arrive largely because there was a vacuum left by all the engineering and the previous industries?
I think this is where you need a historian of Bath University rather than myself. I think this is slightly outside my range of knowledge. I mean, I think that one of the things that does come out of the Second World War is an appreciation of the need for highly skilled engineers, and that there needs to be a formal system of education rather than apprenticeships and that kind of thing. So I think the expansion of higher education in those technical subjects is a result of the Second World War in a way. What will become, the 1944 Education Act, the three-stage secondary education. And then, the expansion of universities, technical universities, is something that comes out of an appreciation that we necessarily didn't have the skills when they were absolutely needed.
Are there any more questions?
Thank you. You haven't mentioned Sparrow's cranes role at all, and I was just wondering what role they
I think
played during
the reason for that is because the story of Sparrow's cranes is a post-war one.
Oh, right, okay. And I was also just wondering how they managed to gear up with all the extra metals, etc., that they needed for all the additional work that they were doing.
You mean these engineering companies?
Yes,
Where they're
yes,
getting the
yes.
materials? Well, I mean, the raw materials are being brought from South Wales and via the Midland Railway from the north. So the raw materials are not being made locally; they're being brought in by rail. From the manufacturing of South and Central Wales and the Midlands.
I have another question for Stuart. Stuart, I believe that Stothert and Pitt developed 2 tanks, one of which was pretty unsuccessful, but one of which actually had quite a big number were made. Is that right?
In the First World War, is this what you're talking about? In the First World War, they were contracted to make an experimental, what would become a tank, which they called a land ship, which ran on tracks, looks a bit like a kind of bus. If you've ever seen, there aren't very many photographs of it, but there are some pictures of them experimenting with it on the site of what's now the university, actually. And this thing is kind of creeping across a muddy field. Not very successful. The Stothert land ship was not a success. During the Second World War, I mean, they don't turn out tanks, they turn out mountings for tanks.
Right.
They make components. I mean, in the same way as they made the disembarkation track for the landing craft, they make mountings for gun mountings for tanks. And they are quite successful for the Matilda tank, which there was a photograph of one. They make mountings for that and bits, but they don't make the tanks
Right.
from scratch.
So I think there was something like 2,000 Matilda.
Yeah,
produced,
they
I
make
think.
lots of bits.
So it's quite, that's
Yeah.
quite a lot of
Yeah.
stuff. Anyway, any other questions before we let Stuart go? Well, can I just thank Stuart for a really interesting talk tonight. I've learned a lot about Bath, about which I had no idea. Again, I really recommend you go to his museum, which I think is fascinating. I'll be going there again soon. And finally, if we can applaud and thank Stuart for his talk tonight.